Welcome back, everyone. Spring and summer is a time for new growth and taking bold action together. So we hope these stories can inspire you to live boldly, take wise chances, and with our friends and family, make a difference together. Today we will be reading The Adventures of Wishbone, Digging to the Center of the Earth by Michael Anthony Steele, inspired by A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. So lean in with a spirit of adventure, grab a friend, and let's enjoy the story together. Chapter 3. The cold ground felt good beneath Professor Lindenbrock's paws as each nail anchored itself firmly onto the rock-covered soil. He looked over his shoulder and down the sight of Mount Snuffles. The black volcanic mountain was spread out below him like a huge blanket stretching out to the plains below. Though the cloudy wisps made by his breath in the icy air, the geologist saw his nephew Axel climbing up after him. Professor knew Axel was a skilled climber, but he felt a bit more at ease after checking on him. Professor wagged his tail, and Axel smiled nervously back at him. Professor Lindenbrock turned back to his own climbing. After carefully making another successful step forward, he looked ahead to the large man climbing in front of them, Hans. Oh boy. Bjelke. I didn't look that one up. I'm so sorry if anyone from Iceland ever sees this. I'm just going to leave it at that. Hans, because all the other books just say Hans. Anyway, their guide, the professor and Axel had hired Hans in the town of Reykjavik, Iceland, the last stop on the easy part of their journey. After that fateful day of the discovery of Sanctusum's coded note, Professor Lindenbrock and Axel had traveled for almost an entire month. First, they had gone by train from Hamburg to Denmark. Then from Denmark, they sailed to Iceland, home of Mount Snuffles. The inside of that volcano, according to Sanctusum, marked the gateway to the center of the earth. In the little port town of Reykjavik, the professor and Axel met Hans, and he agreed to be their guide. Hans spoke only Danish, which was one of the many languages Professor Lindenbrock could speak. Looking up at the Icelander, the professor knew that the guide had no idea of the marvelous part he was about to play in the history of the world. Hans, a calm man of few words, was quite tall, and he had a strong, athletic body. His red hair fit snugly under his hat. Bits of ice were forming in his beard as the chilling wind whipped across his face. Hans was a hunter by trade, but he did not go after the big animals one might expect him to by the look of him. Hans was a hunter of eider feathers. When the eider ducks of Iceland built their nests, they used the very soft feathers from their chests to line them. Hunters like Hans would collect this down, leaving the unharmed ducks to rebuild their nests. Many people in the far north made their living that way. Eider feathers were known to be among the softest feathers in the world, and wealthy people all over paid high prices for items stuffed with the material. Professor watched Hans a moment longer as the eider feather hunter grasped each rock and took each new step with perfect confidence. Professor Lindenbrock's tail wagged. He was very pleased that he had hired such a skilled guide. Continuing the climb up the mountain, Hans pulled himself onto a ledge. Then he turned to pull in the loosely hanging rope that linked him to the professor, and in turn linked the professor to Axel. Professor leaped onto the ledge. Then, grasping the rope in his mouth, he turned and pulled in the loose portion of the rope from between him and Axel. Hans grabbed one of Axel's arms and pulled him easily onto the ledge. Professor Lindenbrock looked out over the wide plains that surrounded Snuffles and looked over the wide. He did not want to stop climbing, but it was clear that his nephew needed a rest. Also, the growling of his stomach told him it was lunchtime. And I really should not argue with my stomach, he thought. Each one took off his heavy knapsack. The three sat quietly, eating their lunch and gazing at the beautiful view from their resting place. The endless Icelandic landscape stretched out before them. They could see deep valleys across one another in every direction. There were smaller mountains that looked like hills. Distant lakes seemed to look more like ponds. Ponds looked like puddles, and rivers seemed to change into brooks. To the right, past the plains and valleys, there were glaciers upon glaciers. Many of the peaks were topped with light, fluffy clouds. The fantastic view meant very little to Professor Lindenbrock. Only one of the peaks, other than the one they were sitting on, interested him. That was Scartaris, the mountain closest to, yet reaching much higher than Snuffles. More importantly, it was the only other mountain mentioned in Sanctusum's message. It was the peak whose shadow would point their way. Professor Lindenbrock was so eager to move on that he wolfed down his food. He was disappointed, however, when Hans insisted they stay put for a good hour in order to rest. While they waited, the professor wondered why Axel was so quiet. Throughout their journey to Iceland, Axel had tried to talk him out of this quest. Obsession, his nephew called it. Axel had told the professor that a journey of 5,000 miles to the climbing of the earth was impossible. He believed climbing into a volcano, although inactive, for over 500 years was like crawling into the nose of a cannon, hoping it was not loaded. Now Axel had fallen silent. The professor had seen him examining certain mineral specimens along the way. Could it be possible Axel had finally been able to see the importance of the truly historical journey they were on? Could Axel finally be realizing that the samples he was finding now could be nothing in comparison to the ones they were bound to discover deep beneath the Earth's surface? Or maybe Axel was quiet because he was too embarrassed to mention his fears in front of a brave man like Hans. Who knew? Only time would tell. For the moment, Professor Lindenbrock was enjoying the silence. The rest of the day they spent climbing the inactive volcano. Sometimes they found themselves walking along a well-made path. Most of the time, however, the journey was quite difficult. The dirt and rocks often crumbled right underneath their feet. Some areas were almost impossible to cross without the travelers helping each other. When they had reached the beginning of the mountain's ice cap, they thought they would never be able to they thought they would never be able to climb onto the steep, slippery surface, but Hans had an idea. He pointed out some rock outcroppings they could climb on. They made an almost perfect set of natural steps. They had been formed by floods of stones thrown up by Snuffle's many great eruptions. Professor Lindenbrock knew that fate was guiding them to their goal. The group steadily made their way up the mighty Snuffles. Finally, they reached a large edge close to the top. The professor called a halt to their trek. "We'll stop here to rest," he said, looking at Axel. They were now over 3,000 feet above sea level and had been climbing for many hours. The wind was picking up, and it was clear that Axel was exhausted. It was bitterly cold, and the wind was blowing hard. "Maybe we should go ahead and camp here for the night," the professor added, trying to hide his great impatience. "Often for," Hans said, shaking his head. Understanding Hans, the professor turned to Axel. "It seems that we must climb even higher," he said back to Hans. "Hans, why must we go higher?" "Monsieur," replied the guide, pointing to the plain below. Professor and Axel looked in the direction where the guide pointed. Below them they saw a giant column of sand and ground-up stone rising to the heavens. It was a giant tornado slowly swirling its way across the plains below. The storm covered a very large area. Its shadow passed over the three travelers as its monstrous force passed between them and the sun. It was tossing rocks and debris all over the new path. In fact, the violent storm had now left the plains. It began heading up the side of Snuffles towards the very ledge they were resting on. In just seconds, the tornado was racing up and up the side of the mountain that had taken them so long and difficult hours to carefully climb. Professor First stood on end. He knew that if this sand spout exploded over them, they would either be crushed in its terrible grip or swept off the mountain like dust under a mighty broom. "Husks, husks!" cried Hans as he returned to climbing the steep volcano. This time the professor didn't have to translate. He saw that Axel was already following Hans, even though he was exhausted. Professor hurriedly followed after them. The angry roar of the approaching tornado followed Lindenbrock. Professor saw where Hans was taking them. Hans was not leading them to the safety of the volcano's crater, although they had been mountain climbing for a couple of hours. It would take several more just to reach the top. Hans seemed to be leading them along a path that would take them around the mountain's side. Professor Lindenbrock realized this was a wise plan. Hans probably knew, as the professor did, that they could never outrun this tornado, but they could cover more ground more quickly if they moved sideways along the volcano rather than struggling straight up its rocky side. Professor hoped their guides' plan would buy them enough time until the huge storm changed its direction. As they climbed around the side of Snuffles, the roar of the whirlwind grew louder. The wind gusting around them also increased, making it more difficult to move. Bits of sand and rock had begun to hit them in there. "Oh no! Hop up. Poor Lindenbrock. You're sleeping on the flame stuffed animal." It's hot. Their backs. Professor turned to take a curious look back at the approaching storm. Once more he was chilled as he witnessed the mighty tornado. It was passing directly over the very spot where he had suggested they stop. Huge stones were pulled from the ground, cast into the air, and thrown around as if during a volcanic eruption. Axel gave a small tug on the rope, and he pulled out the slack between him and his uncle. The sudden motion brought the professor back from the hypnotizing motion of the tornado. He quickly turned around and dug in with all fours, desperate to join the others. He was eager to make sure this incredible journey didn't end before it really began. The wind grew even stronger. The three travelers continued to make their escape. From behind them, the professor heard the deafening roar grow louder and louder. He didn't dare look back. He knew the tornado was right behind them. Then, with strange suddenness, the winds faded. Professor Lindenbrock turned to see the Mistur, as Hans had called it, travel towards the other side of the volcano. The storm was moving quickly away from them, churning up everything in its path like a tremendous plow. Its odd movements had worked in their favor. The tornado was now heading back down the mountain and to the plains below. It no longer seemed to be a danger to them. Professor noticed it was already losing some of its force. Soon he thought it would calm down to nothing more than a cool breeze. Professor Lindenbrock returned his gaze to Axel and Hans. He realized that if he wasn't If it wasn't for the great care and knowledge of their guide, they would have all been thrown to the wind just like dust flying from a meteor. Hans decided it would not be safe to camp on the outside of Snuffles, even though the professor and Axel were tired out from fighting the storm. They agreed with their guide. It took 2 more hours for the weary group to reach the top of the volcano. Travelers were so exhausted from the tornadoes' chase that reaching the top of Snuffles hardly felt like a triumph. Hans picked out an area for their camp just over the top of Snuffles and a few feet inside the volcano's crater. Having gone just inside the mouth of the volcano, they would be fairly safe from any more of Iceland's misdoers. Very tired, everyone ate their supper quietly. Then each traveler found his own space inside the crater's lip and went to sleep. Professor pawed at his blanket, circled twice, then curled into his hard, cold bed. Sleeping in the open air, 5,000 feet above sea level, might have been hard for some people. However, the professor's exhaustion made him drop into a deep sleep. With dreams of great adventure and discoveries ahead, he might as well have been curled up next to the cozy fireplace in his home in Hamburg. Next day, Professor Lindenbrock, Axel, and Hans awoke under the welcome rays of a bright and glorious sun. Although the brisk breeze was still freezing, the professor looked out upon the huge circular crater in which they'd slept. The crater of Mount Snuffles was like a giant upside-down cone. It was about a half-mile across the top and about 500 feet across at the bottom. Its depth was about 2,000 feet. The slope was less steep than the one on the outside of the volcano. Professor had hoped they would be able to reach the bottom of the crater's inside without much difficulty. They gathered up their equipment and ate a lighter breakfast. Then, once again, they tied themselves together with a long rope and began their descent. With Hans in the lead, in order to make the climb down a bit easier, Hans led them into the crater in a zigzag pattern instead of going straight down. The ground inside the volcano was much more solid than it was on the outside. The hardened lava they now walked on didn't crumble away beneath them, as some on the outside surface had. New muscles in the professor's leg awoke as he climbed down instead of up. It was, however, a pleasant change from the hard climb they made the day before. Sometimes Hans would come across a large patch of ice draped solidly over the ancient stones. He tested each step carefully. He always watched for hidden cracks and fissures, deep, open gaps in the ice that might plunge the travelers deep beneath the surface of the frozen snow. Their trek through the crater's inside held little danger or surprise. Only one of their coils of rope slipped from Axel's grasp and rushed by a shortcut to the bottom of the cone. By midday, the trio had reached the bottom of the crater. Professor Lindenbrock saw Axel as he stared with amazement towards the sky above. Axel seemed to be worried again. Professor followed Axel's gaze. The upper opening of the cone acted as a circular frame for the sky. The only thing to break up the view was the peak of Skrtaris. It seemed lost in the great wide open space of the heavens. Professor Lindenbrock looked back to Axel. He was peering into the sky as if he thought he would never see it again. Professors wondered if Axel believed their long climb into the sleeping volcano would have discouraged the professor from reaching his goal. Of course, the climb up Mount Snuffles was an adventure in itself, but it was only an introduction to the great adventure that lay before them. He wished he could convince his nephew of that fact. The professor left Axel to watch the sky. He turned to view the inside of the crater. The bottom of the crater was made up of 3 separate shafts, like chimneys, from which lava had erupted many centuries ago. Wagging his tail, Professor Lindenbrock quickly ran over to examine the shafts, each of which was about 100 feet in diameter. Axel seemed to keep his distance from the gaping shafts. Hans seated himself on a smooth pile of hardened lava and silently watched the professor tour the open chimneys. Suddenly, Professor Lindenbrock's tail wagged wildly when he saw what had been carved on an enormous boulder. Axel, Axel, come here, he cried. Hurry, wonderful, wonderful. Axel quickly ran over to join his uncle. Once Alex was by his side, Professor Lindenbrock raised a paw to point at the exciting inscription on the stone. The ancient fading words read, Arne Sanctusum. Now, Axel, the professor read, do you begin to have faith? Professor Lindenbrock watched as Axel stepped back, amazed at the discovery. The evidence cannot be denied. It is truly overwhelming. Axel continued to go back to where he'd been. Finally, he had reached a clump of hardened lava. Axel followed Hans's example and sat upon it. Professor moved his gaze from the giant stone to the rim of the crater. He then looked at the peak of the nearby mountain, Skrtaris. He caught a quick glimpse of the sun. Then his gaze moved back to the rim of the crater, where Skrtaris' shadow had begun to creep. Now we must be patient. As the great Sanctusum had predicted, the shadow of Skrtaris will point our way like the needle of a huge compass. As the professor spoke, his tail wagged more slowly. There are 3 paths before us, my friends, he continued, but only one leads to the inside of the earth. Professor trotted over and sat with his 2 companions. All 3 travelers watched as the shadow slowly moved down into Snuffles' crater. The waiting was almost unbearable. Finally, a wave of impatience washed over the professor. He leapt from his seat, nose to the ground. He followed the shadow every inch of its slow journey. His tail wagged faster and faster, and the dark phantom came closer to the three shafts. Finally, as if guided by Scientism himself, the shadow of Skirtars fell upon the edge of the central pit. "Here it is!" gasped the professor in a moment of absolute joy. "Here it is! We have found it! Forward, forward!" Hans rose from his seat. "Forward," the guide said calmly, began to move their supplies near the dark entrance of the shaft. With hesitation, Axel got up and approached his uncle and their guide. Then all three stood, gazing into the dark hole. Professor broke the silence. On this day, June 28th, 1863, let the real journey begin. But first, let's take care of our equipment. He turned to the pile of packs that Hans had brought over to them. They must be divided into 4 separate bundles. First, Hans began to separate the supplies into 3 groups. Then he made a 4th bundle consisting of their clothes and climbing ropes. "Hans will take charge of the pickaxes, crowbars, rifle, and gunpowder," the professor said. He turned to his nephew. "Axel, you must take responsibility for the food. I will take care of loading the more delicate instruments like the compass, thermometer, and the manometer, the instrument that measures the pressure of gases or vapors." Axel helped Hans divide their bags. Meanwhile, the professor carefully gathered the scientific instruments with his mouth and placed them onto his own knapsack. Axel then looked over to the 4th pile. "But uncle," he said, "what about our clothes and all this rope? Who will carry them down the shaft?" Professor pulled the last strap of his pack tight with his teeth. He then looked up at Axel. "They will go down by themselves," he said. He looked over to Hans, who had already finished putting together his pack. He had begun to bundle the 4th pile tightly. "How?" asked Axel. "You shall see." Professor Lindenbrock replied as Hans looked to the professor, who simply nodded his head. Hans then tossed the package over the edge of the hole. Both Professor Lindenbrock and Axel knelt side by side and leaned over the edge of the pit. Professor heard the rush of air and the noise of fallen stones as the descending bundle bounced off one of the walls. Then it completely disappeared deep into the darkness. They watched and listened a bit longer, but only silence remained. Professor Lindenbrock turned to look at Axel. His nephew's face was now only inches away from his own. "Now then," he whispered, "it's our turn." "Wow, I bet the pit goes a long way down. We didn't even hear the bundle of clothes and ropes at the bottom. That just goes to prove that sometimes you have to dig really deep to reach your goal. Speaking of digging deep, it's time to check on our little piece of buried treasure back in Oakdale." And that does it for chapter 3. We'll see you soon for chapter 4.